He lived locked away in his own glass fortress, cold and unreachable to everyone. She, a virgin and invisible, cleaned the company's corridors as if she did not exist. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you are listening from. Michael Reynolds observed New York City through the bulletproof windows of his penthouse on the Upper East Side, and for a moment felt that the entire world fit in the palm of his hand. At 42, he had built a financial empire that made cabinet secretaries call him before announcing changes to the economy, and CEOs of multinational corporations wait days for a 15-minute audience. His name wasn't on magazine covers because he preferred it that way. Real power always operated in the shadows, away from the spotlights that blinded fools. That Thursday in March, after closing a deal that would move billions between the United States and Singapore, Michael should have been celebrating, but he couldn't. There was something strange in the air, a feeling he couldn't name, as if the emptiness of his life had finally found a way to physically manifest itself. He dismissed his secretary, cancelled dinner with Japanese investors, and remained alone in his office, surrounded by screens displaying green and red numbers in an infinite dance of profit and loss. That's when the phone rang. The doctor's voice on the other end was professional, but carried that tone only used to deliver bad news. His mother, Eleanor Reynolds, had suffered a massive stroke at her home in the Hamptons. There was nothing that could be done. She was gone before Michael could even process the information. Eleanor was the only person in the world who knew Michael before he transformed into a money-making machine. She knew about the sensitive boy who cried in secret when he saw injured animals, who wrote poetry at 12 and dreamed of being a writer. She knew the teenager who had spent 2 years in an orphanage after his father's death, years Michael never spoke about, but which she knew had left deep scars on his soul. Eleanor was his only connection to the humanity he had buried beneath layers of ambition and calculated coldness. The funeral took place on a grey autumn morning. Michael remained motionless throughout the ceremony, wearing dark glasses even inside the church, observing faces he hadn't seen in years, who now came to offer empty condolences. Businessmen, politicians, socialites, all there not for Eleanor, but for him, trying to score points in a transaction that not even his mother's death could interrupt. When the last guest left, Michael stayed alone in the cemetery, looking at the Italian marble tombstone he had ordered made with desperate urgency. That night, he returned to the office. He couldn't go home, to the penthouse where Eleanor had spent her last Sundays, playing with the grandchildren he never gave her, talking about granddaughters he would never bring into the world. The commercial building was empty, with only a few security lights cutting through the darkness of the corridors. Michael went up to the 40th floor, opened a bottle of Scottish whiskey from 1964 that he kept for special occasions, and for the first time in 20 years allowed himself to fall apart. He sat on the cold marble floor of his office, took from his pocket a yellowed photo Eleanor had given him years before, him at 5 years old, smiling in her arms on a Cape Cod beach, before life became a succession of losses and betrayals. The tears came without warning, silent and hot, and Michael cried as he hadn't since childhood. He cried for his dead mother, for the father he'd lost too early, for the boy who had gotten lost somewhere on the path between innocence and power. That's how Emily found him. She had arrived for the midnight shift, as she had been doing for 2 years. Emily Walker, 23, was practically invisible to the executives who frequented that building during the day. She arrived at 11 at night and left before 6 in the morning, cleaning offices, emptying trash cans, wiping down desks where the fates of thousands of people were decided. She was an efficient and silent ghost, exactly as she had learned to be at the Sacred Heart of Jesus orphanage in Rochester, where she had grown up after her mother died in childbirth and no relatives appeared to claim her. Emily stopped at the door of Michael's office, shocked. She had cleaned that room dozens of times, always respecting the sign that said, "No entry after 6 p.m., but she had never seen him there outside business hours. And she had never seen him like this, vulnerable, human, broken. For 2 years, Michael Reynolds had been just a legend to her. The name whispered with reverence and fear by other employees, the powerful ghost who commanded everything from that tower of glass and steel. Now, seeing him undone on the floor, holding a photograph against his chest as if it were a talisman, Emily felt something move inside her. It wasn't pity. She knew pity too well, had received toxic doses of it throughout her childhood. It was something different, deeper. It was recognition. She too knew what it was like to cry alone in the darkness. She too knew what it was like to carry the weight of losses that never seemed to fully heal. She should have left. She should have quietly closed the door and cleaned the other offices, leaving this powerful man with his private pain. But Emily stayed, watching him for a few minutes that seemed like hours, feeling a strange connection with that solitary figure who, until then, had been just a distant shadow in her life of invisible servitude. Emily backed away slowly, but couldn't completely distance herself. Something about that devastated man held her there, as if an invisible force prevented her from continuing with her mechanical cleaning routine. Michael hadn't noticed her yet, lost as he was in his particular pain, and she took advantage of these moments to really observe him for the first time. Without the impeccable suits, without the rigid posture that intimidated even the most experienced executives, without the mask of coldness he wore during the day, Michael seemed almost fragile. His dark hair, always perfectly aligned, was disheveled. The hands that signed million-dollar contracts trembled slightly as they held the photograph. When Michael finally raised his eyes and saw her standing at the door, Emily felt her heart race. She expected anger, expected him to expel her with the brutality he was known for in the company corridors. But what she saw in his eyes was something completely different. A vulnerability so raw that it made her blush. For a few endless seconds, they just looked at each other. Two strangers united by the coincidence of a shared pain in the middle of the night. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," Emily murmured, her voice sounding hoarser than normal. "I didn't know you were here. I can come back later to—" "No," Michael interrupted, and his voice also came out different, stripped of its usual authority. "You can stay. I need to get out of here anyway." But he didn't move. He continued sitting on the floor, looking at her as if he were trying to decipher a puzzle. Emily felt exposed under that intense gaze, as if he could read all the secrets she kept, all the nights she had dreamed of situations exactly like this, alone with a powerful man, being seen, being noticed, being desired. She blushed even more as she realized the direction of her thoughts and lowered her eyes. In the days that followed, something changed between them, although neither knew quite what. Michael began to stay longer at the office, always finding excuses to work late. Emily, in turn, began to pay more attention to the details of his office. She noticed that he always drank his coffee without sugar, so she began to leave small sachets next to the cup, a silent invitation for him to try a little sweetness. She noticed that he read philosophy books in the intervals between meetings, so she began to leave small papers between the pages, with Bible verses or inspirational phrases she had memorized during her years at the orphanage. Michael, a man who rarely paid attention to details that didn't involve numbers and profits, began to notice these small changes. The sugar that mysteriously appeared next to his coffee, the discreet messages hidden in his books, the way his desk became slightly more organized, as if someone had paid special attention to what was important to him. And gradually, without being able to avoid it, he began to wait for these small signs of Emily's presence. One night, 3 weeks after his mother's funeral, Michael decided to purposely stay longer at the office, hoping to meet her. When Emily arrived for the midnight shift and saw him there, this time sitting in his Italian leather armchair, she felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that made her tremble slightly. He was reading one of the books where she had left one of her messages, and when he raised his eyes to her, Emily saw something different in his gaze, an intensity that made her feel as if she were being undressed by those dark eyes. "Emily," he said her name for the first time, and she was surprised to realize that he knew what she was called. "Thank you for the messages." She didn't know what to answer. For years she had been trained by the nuns to keep her eyes down, to speak only when asked, to be invisible and submissive. But something about Michael awakened a part of her that she had kept carefully buried, a part that wanted to be seen, that wanted to be noticed, that wanted to be desired by this dangerous and powerful man. "May I ask a question?" Michael continued, rising from the armchair and walking slowly toward her. Emily nodded, not trusting her own voice. "Why do you do this? Why do you care about a stranger?" The question caught her off guard. Emily opened her mouth to give an automatic response, something about Christian charity and compassion for others, but the words that came out were completely different, more honest than she expected. "Because I recognize the pain in your eyes," she whispered, finally finding the courage to look directly at him. "It's the same pain I see in the mirror every day." Michael stopped a few steps from her, so close that Emily could smell his masculine cologne mixed with the aroma of the whiskey he had been drinking. The tension between them was almost palpable, charged with an electricity that neither knew how to interpret. Emily felt her heart beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. "You don't know me," Michael murmured, but his voice didn't sound like a warning, it sounded like an invitation. "You don't know what I'm capable of, and you don't know me," Emily responded, surprising herself with her boldness. "You don't know what I dream about." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings that neither dared to fully acknowledge. Emily's words echoed in the silent office like a dangerous confession. Michael studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, as if he could see through the layers of submission she had built over the years to protect the passionate woman who hid underneath. There was something in her eyes, a spark of defiance that completely contrasted with her timid posture and restrained gestures. Michael felt a hunger he hadn't experienced in years, not the superficial hunger he felt for the sophisticated women who paraded through his life, but something more primitive, more real. "What do you dream about, Emily?" he asked, taking another step toward her, reducing the distance between them even more. His voice came out hoarser than he intended, carrying a curiosity that bordered on obsession. Emily felt her legs tremble. For 15 years, since she had discovered the sensations her own body could produce, she had nurtured secret fantasies that she had never dared to confess to anyone. In moments of solitude in her small room at the boarding house where she lived, she imagined situations exactly like this: powerful, dangerous men who saw her not as the invisible orphan who cleaned offices, but as a desirable and fascinating woman. She imagined being dominated by intense gazes, by authoritative voices, by hands that knew exactly what they wanted. But now, faced with the real man who could transform her fantasies into reality, Emily felt simultaneously terrified and excited. She lowered her eyes, unable to sustain Michael's penetrating gaze, and murmured an evasive answer. "I dream of a different life, with someone who really sees me." "I am seeing you," Michael answered, and there was something in the way he said it that made Emily shiver from head to toe. "I've been seeing you for weeks, and what I see intrigues me more than it should." He then backed away, as if he had realized he was going too far, dangerously close to a line that shouldn't be crossed. Michael returned to his desk, but couldn't concentrate on the documents he had left scattered. Emily's presence filled the office in a way he couldn't ignore. He observed her discreetly as she performed her tasks, noticing the gracefulness with which she moved, the delicacy with which she treated his belongings, as if each book, each object on his desk were something sacred. Emily, in turn, felt hyper-aware of each movement. She knew he was watching her, and this awareness awakened sensations that she didn't know how to control. When she leaned over to clean the shelf behind his desk, she noticed that Michael had stopped pretending to read and was openly observing her. She blushed intensely but didn't back away. Something inside her, a part she had kept carefully repressed, liked being watched by him that way. In the days that followed, a dangerous and silent dance was established between them. Michael began to work later frequently, always arranging excuses to be in the office when Emily arrived. She, in turn, began to take more time to clean his office, inventing unnecessary tasks to prolong the moments when they were alone together. The conversations were brief, loaded with implications, but the sexual tension between them grew with each encounter. One night, Michael could no longer control himself. He had drunk more than normal, tormented by erotic dreams that had Emily as the protagonist, dreams from which he woke sweaty and disturbed. When she arrived, he was waiting for her standing near the window, observing the city lights. "Emily," he called without turning around. "I need to know something." "What, Mr. Reynolds?" "Stop calling me sir," he said, finally turning to her. "When we're alone, I'm just Michael." The name sounded different in his mouth, more intimate, more dangerous. Emily nodded, not trusting her own voice. "Have you ever been with a man?" Michael asked directly, without beating around the bush. The question caught her completely off guard. Emily felt her face burn, but there was something in his gaze that prevented her from lying. "No," she whispered, and the admission seemed to echo in the office like a promise or a provocation. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were waging an internal battle. When he reopened them, There was a dark determination in his gaze that made Emily tremble. "This is dangerous," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You are dangerous." "Why?" Emily asked, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Because you make me want things I shouldn't want," Michael admitted, walking slowly toward her. "Because you make me feel things I've spent years trying to bury." He stopped right in front of her, so close that Emily could see the small wrinkles around his eyes, could feel the heat emanating from his body. He raised his hand slowly, as if he were going to touch her face, but stopped a few centimeters from her skin. "If I touch you," he said in a low voice, "there's no going back." Emily looked into his eyes and saw the same hunger she felt burning inside herself. She tilted her face slightly toward his hand, a small movement, but one that carried all the force of an irreversible decision. "Maybe I don't want there to be a way back," she whispered. It was all Michael needed to hear. The touch was electric. Michael slid his fingers over Emily's face with a delicacy that contrasted with the hungry intensity in his eyes. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the sensation of being touched by those hands that commanded empires, that signed destinies, that now trembled slightly against her skin as if she were made of crystal. It was her first real masculine touch, and every nerve ending in her body awakened simultaneously, creating a symphony of sensations she had never experienced. "Emily." Michael murmured her name like a prayer or a curse. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to back away, to flee, to maintain the safe distance that separated their worlds. But she didn't back away. Instead, she parted her lips in an anticipation that surprised her with its boldness. When his lips finally touched hers, it was as if something exploded inside her. The kiss began tentatively, exploratory, but quickly deepened into a mutual hunger that left them breathless. Michael forced himself to pull away before he completely lost control. He looked at Emily, seeing her swollen lips, her glazed eyes of desire, her chest rising and falling in an irregular breathing pattern. She was even more beautiful like this, awakened to her own sensuality, and it drove him crazy. But it also terrified him. There was something about Emily that awakened in him not just desire, but a need for possession, for protection, for control that went beyond the physical. "You need to go," he said, fighting against every instinct that screamed to keep her there, to explore her completely. "Now, before I do something I can't undo." Emily looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. She knew he was right. They were playing with fire, two worlds that should never touch. But as she walked to the door, she felt transformed. She was no longer the invisible orphan who had entered that office. She was a woman who had tasted desire and wanted more. Michael spent the rest of the night pacing the office like a caged animal, unable to concentrate on anything other than the taste of Emily's lips, the sound of her broken breathing, the way she had given herself to that kiss with a passion that completely belied her apparent innocence. He knew he had crossed a dangerous line, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. In the days that followed, Michael tried to keep his distance. He avoided working late, forced himself to return home at normal times, tried to resume his usual routine. But Emily had become an obsession. He thought about her during the most important meetings, saw her face reflected in the computer screens, dreamed about her every night. It was as if she had awakened a part of him that he had kept carefully dormant, the part that was still capable of feeling, of desiring something beyond power and money. The need to see her again became unbearable. Michael began to discreetly investigate Emily's life, using the resources of his private security company. He discovered where she lived, a modest boarding house in Chinatown sharing a tiny room with another woman. He learned about her routine. She woke up at 6 in the evening, took crowded buses to get to work, spent weekends at the public library reading books she couldn't afford to buy. He discovered about her education at the orphanage, about the complete absence of family, about the life of deprivation she led. The most disturbing information was discovering that Emily kept a diary. Michael gained access to it through methods he preferred not to examine too closely, bribing her roommate to photograph some pages when Emily wasn't there. What he read left him simultaneously excited and disturbed. Emily had meticulously documented her sexual fantasies, erotic dreams with powerful men who dominated her, who completely possessed her. There were discreet drawings, detailed descriptions of scenarios she imagined, confessions of a repressed but ardent sexuality. Even more shocking was discovering that, in recent weeks, her fantasies had gained a specific face: his. Emily had written about dreams where Michael touched her, where he took her beyond the limits of passion that she knew only in theory. There were excerpts where she confessed to thinking about him during lonely nights, where she admitted to touching herself, imagining his hands on her body. It was a window into a soul that he had never imagined existed beneath the timid surface she presented to the world. Michael knew he was invading her privacy in an unforgivable way, but he couldn't stop. Emily had become a necessity, an addiction more powerful than any drug. He needed to know her completely, to possess her in every aspect. The idea that other men might discover the fire that burned inside her left him furious with a possessive jealousy he had never experienced. That's when he decided to act. Using his influence, Michael arranged for Emily to be transferred to a special shift, executive night cleaning, working exclusively on the floor where his office was located. She would be the only cleaning employee on that floor, working alone without supervision. She would be his completely during the long hours of the night. When Emily received notification of the transfer, accompanied by a significant increase in salary, she immediately knew that Michael was behind it. The realization both excited and frightened her in equal measure. He was showing that he could control her life, manipulate her reality, and this should have outraged her. Instead, it awakened in her an erotic submission that she barely understood. The idea of being completely at his mercy, of being desired to the point that he restructured the world around them to have her close, made something melt inside her belly. On the first night of the new role, Emily arrived at the executive floor with her heart racing. Michael was waiting for her in his office, but this time there was no pretense of work or coincidence. He was clearly there for her, and they both knew it. "You know why I did this," he said when she entered. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Emily responded, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "And you know I came anyway." Michael smiled, a dangerous smile, loaded with dark promises. "Then you understand the rules of the game we're playing." "What rules?" Emily asked, though she knew she would regret the question. "Here alone you are mine," Michael said, walking slowly toward her. "Completely mine." Michael's words echoed in the office like a sentence, loaded with an authority that made Emily tremble from head to toe. She should have felt indignant, should have protested against that possessive arrogance. Instead, she felt a wave of heat spread through her body, a submission that came from some deep and primitive place in her soul. For years she had fantasized about exactly this, being desired with such intensity that a powerful man would restructure the world just to have her close. "And if I don't want to be yours?" she challenged, but her voice came out trembling, belying the provocation. Michael smiled, a dark smile that revealed he knew every secret she kept. "We both know you want to be," he said, stopping right in front of her. "I read your diary, Emily. I know every fantasy of yours, every erotic dream, every time you thought of me while touching yourself alone in bed." The revelation hit her like a slap. Emily felt the blood drain from her face, replaced by a burning shame that made her want to disappear. At the same time, the idea that he had read her most intimate confessions, that he knew the thoughts she believed were safe in the privacy of her diary, awakened in her a disturbing excitement. It was an unforgivable violation, but it was also proof that she obsessed him as much as he obsessed her. "You had no right," she whispered, but it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like a surrender. "I have the right to everything I want," Michael responded, sliding a finger along the line of her jaw. "And I want you in a way that shouldn't be legal." Emily closed her eyes under his touch, losing herself in the sensation of being desired with such intensity. When she opened them again, she saw that Michael was observing her with a hunger that went beyond the physical. There was something darker in his eyes, a need to possess her not just bodily, but completely, to mark every piece of her soul as his territory. "Do you know what I did to have you here?" he continued, his voice low and hypnotic. "I reorganized the entire structure of the company. I paid to have your life investigated. I bribed people to gain access to your most intimate thoughts. You should be running, Emily. You should be afraid of me." "I am afraid," she admitted, but didn't back away. "But not in the way you think." "Of what, then?" "I'm afraid that you'll stop," Emily confessed, surprising herself with the brutal honesty. "I'm afraid that this is just a game to you, and that when you get bored I'll go back to being invisible." The confession hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. He had expected resistance, perhaps moral indignation, but not that total surrender, that raw vulnerability. Emily was offering herself completely, admitting that she preferred to be possessed by him than to return to the invisibility of her previous life. It was at once the most precious gift he had ever received and the most terrifying responsibility he had ever assumed. "Look at me," Michael ordered, holding her face between his hands. "This is not a game. What I feel for you goes beyond anything I've ever experienced. You haunt me, Emily. Since that first night when I saw you standing at the door, I can't think of anything else." He kissed her then, but this time there was no hesitation or delicacy. It was a hungry, desperate kiss, loaded with weeks of repressed desire. Emily responded with a passion that surprised her, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling around them. When they separated, both were breathless. "I want to show you something," Michael said, taking her hand. He guided her to his desk, where he opened a locked drawer and removed a folder. "This is everything I managed to find out about you. Every detail of your life. Every document, every photograph." Emily leafed through the folder with growing astonishment. There was her birth certificate, orphanage records, photographs of her that she didn't even know existed, detailed reports about her daily routine. It was disturbing to see her entire life reduced to documents, but it was also proof of his obsession with her. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to know how far I would go to have you," Michael responded, "and because there's something else you need to know." He took out one last folder from the drawer, this one even more voluminous than the first. "When I began investigating you, I discovered something about the orphanage where you grew up. Sacred Heart of Jesus Orphanage in Rochester." Emily nodded, not understanding where he was going. "I also grew up in an orphanage," Michael continued, his voice acquiring a darker tone. "Different from yours, but equally traumatic. When my mother died, when I began to feel this obsessive need to protect you, to possess you, I began investigating these institutions. I discovered terrible things, Emily. Abuse, neglect, children who disappeared without explanation." Emily felt a chill down her spine. She remembered whispers among the older children, of sisters who appeared and disappeared without explanation, of an atmosphere of fear that hung over the place disguised as religious discipline. "I bought the orphanage," Michael said simply. "I bought it and closed it. I had every person who worked there in the last 30 years investigated. Some are in prison now. Others disappeared." The revelation left Emily speechless. Michael had discovered her past, investigated her traumas, and taken measures to ensure that others didn't go through what she went through. It was protection and vengeance, care and control, all mixed in a way that she didn't know how to interpret. "You did this for me?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "I did it for us," Michael corrected. "Because I can't love you completely, knowing that there's a place in the world where you suffered and nobody paid for it." The word love hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. It was the first time either of them had used that word, and its force surprised them. Michael seemed to realize the weight of what he had said, but didn't back down. "Yes," he said, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. "I love you, Emily. In an obsessive, possessive, probably unhealthy way, but I love you in a way that I've never loved anyone." Emily felt tears spring to her eyes. No one had ever fought for her, had cared enough to avenge her past hurts, to protect her from the ghosts that haunted her. It was love, yes, but a dark, dangerous love that came with a price she hadn't yet fully calculated. Emily's tears fell silently. But they weren't tears of sadness. It was the first time someone had cared enough to completely know her pain, to do something about it. Michael misinterpreted her silence and took a step back, as if he had suddenly realized the magnitude of his confessions, how much he had revealed of his obsessive and controlling nature. "I've frightened you," he said, running his hands through his hair in a rare display of nervousness. "You're seeing now what I'm capable of. You should leave, Emily. You should run as far away from me as possible." Instead, she approached him. She raised her hands and touched his face with the same delicacy with which he had touched hers, feeling the texture of his unshaven beard, the tension of the muscles in his jaw. Michael closed his eyes under the touch, as if he were surrendering to a sweet torture. "No one has ever fought for me before," Emily whispered. "No one has ever cared enough to know my pain. You see me, Michael. Really, Even the parts of me that I hide from myself. You don't understand, Michael murmured, opening his eyes to look at her. What I feel for you isn't normal. It's sick. I want to possess you completely. I want you to be mine in a way that goes beyond what's healthy or right. And what if I want that too? Emily asked, surprising them both with her boldness. What if I've spent my whole life waiting for someone who would want me exactly like that? Michael studied her for a long moment, looking for signs of fear, of hesitation, of anything that might indicate she didn't completely understand what she was offering. But what he saw in her eyes was total acceptance, a surrender that went beyond the physical. Emily was offering herself entirely, aware of the price, aware of the dangers, but willing to pay anything to be loved in that intense and total way. He picked her up then, carrying her to the leather sofa in his office. Emily felt small and fragile in his arms, but not vulnerable, protected. Michael laid her down carefully, as if she were made of the most precious material in the world, and knelt beside the sofa, studying every detail of her face. If we do this, he said, his voice hoarse with desire, there's no going back. You will be mine, Emily. Completely. I won't be able to let you go afterwards. I don't want you to let me go, she responded, pulling him down until his lips almost touched hers. I've belonged to you since that first night, when you cried on the floor and I should have left, but couldn't. What happened next was both wild and tender, hungry and reverent. Michael explored every inch of her body as if he were memorizing a sacred map. And Emily discovered sensations that surpassed all her most ardent fantasies. When they finally united, it was with an intensity that left them both breathless, a connection that went far beyond the physical. It was the fusion of two souls that had spent their entire lives feeling incomplete, finally finding their other half. Afterwards, as Emily rested in his arms, Michael traced invisible drawings on her naked skin, still hardly believing she was there, that she was his. But even in the midst of the most intense happiness he had ever experienced, a shadow hung over him. There was something else Emily needed to know, something that could destroy everything they had built. Emily, he said, his voice tense, there's something else about your investigation. Something I discovered about your biological mother. Emily tensed in his arms. Her mother was a subject she avoided thinking about, a source of pain she had learned to keep buried. She knew only that she had died in childbirth, that there was no family to claim her, that she was truly an orphan in the world. She had a relationship before she died, Michael continued, each word costing a visible effort. A relationship with a rich older man who abandoned her when he found out she was pregnant. Emily sat up on the sofa, pulling a blanket to cover herself, sensing that what would come next would change everything. Michael, what are you trying to tell me? His name was Michael, he said, avoiding her gaze. Michael Smith, not Reynolds, but Michael. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily felt the world spin around her, the terrible possibility that Michael was suggesting crystallizing in her mind. If it were true, if Michael were her biological father, then what they had just done was an abomination. The love they felt for each other would transform into an unforgivable sin. Are you saying you might be my father? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know, Michael admitted, finally looking at her. The dates coincide, the age coincides, and there are other coincidences that disturb me. My obsession with you from the first moment, the need to protect you that goes beyond rational, the feeling that I've known you longer than is possible. Emily moved away from him, covering her face with her hands. The possibility was too devastating to process. If it were true, then she had given herself to her own father, had discovered love in the arms of the man who should represent paternal protection, not erotic passion. I need to know, she said, standing up from the sofa with trembling legs. I need to be sure. Emily, wait. Michael tried to hold her, but she moved away from his touch as if it burned. Don't touch me, she said, quickly putting on her clothes. Not until we know the truth. If you're my father, if what we did is what I'm thinking, even if I am, Michael interrupted, standing up too, that doesn't change what I feel. It doesn't change the fact that I love you. The declaration shocked her even more than the previous revelation. How can you say that? How can you talk about love if there's a possibility we're father and daughter? Because what I feel for you transcends any moral category the world might impose, Michael responded, putting on his pants. If we're related by blood, it was fate that placed one in the other's path. If we're not, even better. But either way, you are mine, Emily, and I am yours." Emily looked at him with horror and fascination mixed. Even faced with the possibility of committing incest, Michael didn't back down, didn't show regret. His obsession with her was so total that it transcended even fundamental social taboos. It was at once terrifying and, in a disturbed way, romantic. "I need to go," she said, walking toward the door. "I need to think. I need to discover the truth." "Emily," Michael called to her when she reached the door, "no matter what we discover, I won't let you go. I'll find a way for us to be together." She looked at him one last time, seeing the dark determination in his eyes, and knew he was serious. Michael would fight against the entire world, against the laws of nature and morality, to keep her by his side. It was a promise and a threat, wrapped in a declaration of love so intense that it defied everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. Emily left the building like a sleepwalker, her trembling legs barely supporting her, as she walked through the deserted streets of New York in the early morning. The city seemed different, as if she were seeing it through a distorted filter. The streetlights created threatening shadows, the distant sound of traffic sounded like a lament, and every reflection in the windows of buildings seemed to show her Michael's face, pursuing her even when she tried to flee from her thoughts. She arrived at the boarding house where she lived, without even remembering the journey. Her roommate Megan was sleeping, and Emily silently thanked her for not having to face questions about where she had spent the night, about why she arrived with this devastated expression on her face. She sat on the small bed she had occupied for 2 years and tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The intensity of what she had experienced with Michael still pulsed in every fiber of her body. Each touch, each kiss, each moment of total surrender was engraved in her memory with a painful clarity. For the first time in her life, she had experienced what it was to be completely desired, loved with an intensity that defied reason. But now, the possibility that that love was built on a foundation of horror left her nauseated. During the days that followed, Emily didn't return to work. She called saying she was sick, but in reality she was paralyzed by uncertainty. She spent hours at the public library, obsessively researching her own origin, looking for any clue that could confirm or rule out the terrible possibility that Michael had raised. She found birth certificates, hospital records, orphanage documents, but nothing that definitively clarified the identity of her biological father. Michael, for his part, was going crazy with her absence. In the first days, he respected her space, believing she needed time to process the revelation. But when Emily didn't appear for work, when she didn't respond to the messages he left at her boarding house, when it became clear that she was avoiding any contact, his obsession transformed into desperation. He hired the best private investigators in the country, specialized DNA testing laboratories, genealogists who tracked entire family trees. Michael needed the truth as much as Emily, but for different reasons. He didn't care if they were father and daughter. That moral taboo had no power over the force of what he felt for her. But he knew that Emily cared, and that without this answer he would never have her back. Meanwhile, Emily had made a desperate decision. She returned to Rochester, to the city where she had grown up, determined to find answers in the place where it all began. The Sacred Heart of Jesus orphanage was closed, as Michael had said, but the building was still standing, abandoned and covered with wild vegetation. Emily managed to enter through a broken window at the back and walked through the shadowy corridors where she had spent her early years. The chapel, where children were forced to pray 3 times a day, was in ruins. The wooden benches were rotting under leaks, and the colored stained glass was broken, creating kaleidoscopic patterns of light on the dusty floor. It was there, kneeling in the same place where she had prayed 1,000 times, asking for a family, that Emily found something that would change everything. Hidden behind the altar, in a rusty metal box that had probably been forgotten for decades, were letters. Letters written by her mother, Maria Walker, documenting a tumultuous relationship with a man she referred to only as M. Emily read every word with her heart racing, reconstructing through those yellowed pages the love story that had resulted in her birth. Maria was young, only 17 when she met M at a graduation party in New York. He was older, rich, powerful, and she had fallen hopelessly in love with that man who represented everything her simple life in the suburbs didn't offer. The romance had lasted months, intense and secret, until Maria discovered she was pregnant. When she told M, he disappeared from her life, as if he had never existed. leaving her alone to face the pregnancy and rejection from her conservative family. But in the last letters, the ones written shortly before the birth, Maria had finally revealed the full name of her lover, Michael Smith Sanders, not Michael Reynolds. Emily felt the world spin around her when she read that name. It wasn't the same Michael. They weren't father and daughter. The horror that had consumed her thoughts in recent weeks dissolved like smoke, replaced by a relief so intense that it made her collapse in tears. But there was more. In the last letter, Maria revealed that she had discovered who Michael Smith Sanders really was. A young man from a rich family who used a false name to hide romantic adventures from his conservative parents. His real name was Robert Reynolds Smith, younger brother of Michael Reynolds' father. That made Michael her uncle, not her father, but it still meant they were related by blood. Emily held the letters against her chest, trying to process this new revelation. They weren't father and daughter, but uncle and niece. It was less shocking than the previous possibility, but it still meant they were blood relatives. It still meant that their love carried a mark of prohibition that society would never accept. When she finally returned to New York 3 days later, Emily knew what she needed to do. She could no longer run from Michael, could no longer avoid the conversation that would define their future. He deserved to know the truth, even if that truth didn't completely resolve the moral dilemma that surrounded them. Michael was waiting for her in his office, and Emily was shocked by the transformation. He had lost weight, the deep circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and there was a tension in his posture that she had never seen before. When he saw her enter, Michael stood up slowly as if he didn't believe she was really there. "I discovered the truth," Emily said without preamble, removing the letters from her purse. "About my mother, about my father, about us." Michael said nothing, just waited, preparing himself for any revelation that could definitively destroy any chance of a future together. "You're not my father," Emily continued, seeing the instant relief in his eyes. "But we're also not strangers. My father was Robert Reynolds Smith, your uncle." The silence that followed was dense, loaded with implications. Michael processed the information slowly, understanding that although they weren't father and daughter, they were still uncle and niece. They still carried common blood in their veins. It was less traumatic than the previous possibility, but it still meant that their love was forbidden by social conventions. "Does that change anything for you?" Michael finally asked, his voice tense. Emily looked into his eyes and saw the same hunger, the same obsession, the same desperate love that had been there since the first day. The revelation hadn't changed anything about what he felt for her. And she realized with surprise, it hadn't changed what she felt for him either. "It should change things," she admitted, "but it doesn't. I still love you, Michael. I still belong to you, regardless of the blood we share." Michael walked toward her slowly, as if fearing that any sudden movement might make her disappear again. "Then we're both lost," he murmured, touching her face with trembling fingers. "Two lost souls who found each other in the darkness and refused to let go, even knowing the entire world will condemn us." "Then let the world condemn us," Emily whispered, leaning into his touch. "I'd rather be condemned at your side than saved alone." The kiss that followed was different from all the previous ones. There was a desperate urgency, as if both knew they were sealing a dangerous pact, consciously choosing a path that would place them against the entire world. Michael pulled her to him with a force that bordered on desperation, as if trying to fuse their bodies into a single entity that couldn't be separated by social conventions or moral judgments. When they separated, both knew they had crossed a definitive line. They were no longer two strangers who had met by chance. They were accomplices in a transgression that would unite them forever. Two outcasts who had chosen forbidden love over social acceptance. "Let's leave here," Michael said suddenly, surprising Emily with the determination in his voice. "Let's go somewhere where nobody knows us, where we can just be Michael and Emily, two people who love each other. Not uncle and niece, not boss and employee. Just us." The proposal was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Emily knew that Michael had the resources to make them disappear, to build a new life anywhere in the world where their family history wouldn't reach them. But she also knew that it would mean abandoning everything, her identity, her history, her homeland. It would be a voluntary exile in the name of love. "And if someone discovers?" she asked, not out of fear of scandal, but out of fear that Michael would tire of the fugitive life they would have to lead. "Nobody will discover," Michael responded with the confidence of someone who had always managed to control his reality. I built an empire by manipulating information, controlling narratives. I can easily create a new story for both of us. During the weeks that followed, Michael put a meticulous plan in motion. Using his vast network of contacts and unlimited resources, he began to build alternative identities for both of them. Emily Walker would become Eleanor Silva, an independent translator from Miami. Michael Reynolds would transform into Matthew Richards, a retired financial consultant. They would have complete histories, impeccable documents, fabricated pasts that would withstand any superficial investigation. Their new life would be in Santa Barbara, a city large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough to allow them to start again without the metropolitan pressures of New York. Michael had bought a house by the sea, in a gated community where privacy was guaranteed. It would be a refuge where they could live their love without needing to hide or justify. Emily, initially reluctant to completely abandon her identity, gradually allowed herself to be seduced by the prospect of a life where she wouldn't need to hide. Throughout her existence, she had been invisible, in the orphanage, in the boarding house, at work. The idea of being seen, desired, and openly loved by Michael, even under false names, was irresistible. But not everything would go as planned. A week before the scheduled move, Emily received an unexpected visit at her boarding house. Megan, her roommate, brought disturbing news. A man had been asking questions about Emily in the neighborhood, showing photographs, offering money for information about her routine and relationships. He said he was a journalist, Megan told her, clearly nervous. But he didn't seem like a journalist. He seemed dangerous. He said he was investigating a story about you and a rich businessman. Emily, what's going on? Emily's blood froze. Someone had discovered her relationship with Michael. Someone was investigating, collecting evidence, probably preparing a scandal that would destroy them both. She immediately thought of Robert Smith, Michael's uncle, who was her biological father. If he were still alive, if he had discovered her existence and her connection to Michael, that night when she told Michael about the investigator, he remained silent for a long time, processing the implications. Finally, he made some calls to his private security team. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. "It's Robert," he said, hanging up the phone. "My uncle didn't die as everyone thought. He's been hiding in Europe for years, fleeing financial scandals. When he heard about my obsession with a cleaning staff member, he began investigating. He discovered who you really are." "What does he want?" Emily asked, though she sensed she wouldn't like the answer. "Blackmail," Michael answered, his voice carrying a cold anger. "Robert has always been a parasite. Now he's bankrupt, desperate, and saw in us an opportunity for extortion. He threatens to expose our relationship, reveal our family connection, destroy my reputation and yours, unless I transfer an obscene amount of money to him." Emily felt nauseated. Not because of the money, she knew Michael could pay any amount, but from the realization that they would never be truly free. There would always be someone who would discover their secret, always a new threat hanging over their heads. "Pay him," she said simply. "Give him what he wants, and let's be done with it." "No," Michael replied with a determination that frightened her. "I won't spend the rest of my life being blackmailed by that worm, and I won't allow him to transform our love into something dirty, into something shameful." "Then what are we going to do?" Michael looked at her with that dark expression she had learned to recognize. It was the look he had when making the most dangerous decisions, when he was willing to do anything to protect what he loved. "We're going to eliminate the problem," he said simply. Emily felt a chill down her spine. "Michael, what are you trying to say?" "Robert is a fugitive criminal living under a false identity in Europe. It would be very easy for him to suffer an accident, very easy for him to simply disappear." The suggestion shocked her deeply. Michael was proposing to murder his own uncle to protect their relationship. It was an extreme demonstration of his obsession, of how far he was willing to go to keep her by his side. It was terrifying and, in a disturbed way, moving. "You would kill for me?" she asked, almost whispering. "I would kill anyone for you," Michael answered without hesitation. "I would do anything to protect what we have. You are more important to me than my own soul, Emily. If I need to become a murderer to keep you safe, to keep our love safe, then that's what I'll do." Emily looked at him for a long moment, seeing the absolute sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing, wasn't trying to impress her with empty bravado. Michael really was willing to commit murder to protect her. It was the most intense and most dangerous love she could imagine. "No," she said finally. "I won't allow you to become a murderer because of me. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Michael insisted. "Robert won't stop. Men like him never stop. Even if we pay this time, he'll come back asking for more, and more, until he completely destroys us." Emily closed her eyes, trying to think of an alternative that didn't involve death or destruction. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze. "Then let's give him what he really wants," she said. "Not money, scandal. Let's make our story public, on our terms, before he can do it." Michael looked at her as if she had gone mad. "Emily, if we do that, we'll be destroyed by the media, by society. We'll never have peace again." "But we'll be together," she answered, "and no one will be able to blackmail us anymore with a secret that is no longer a secret." It was a desperate strategy, but perhaps it was the only way to escape the cycle of blackmail without Michael needing to get blood on his hands. Emily's proposal left Michael silent for several minutes. He paced the office like a caged predator, processing the implications of making public a relationship he had kept in the shadows precisely to protect them from social judgment. But gradually, he began to see the desperate genius of her strategy. If they controlled the narrative, if they told their own story before Robert could distort it, perhaps they could survive the scandal. "It would be social suicide," Michael murmured, more to himself than to her. "My company, my reputation, everything I've worked for decades would be destroyed." "And what's worth more?" Emily asked, approaching him. "Your empire or our chance to be together without needing to hide?" Michael stopped pacing and looked at her. In Emily's eyes, he saw the same determination that he recognized in himself when making the riskiest business decisions. She was willing to face the social storm that would follow, willing to be publicly judged and condemned as long as they could be together. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. We'll be marked forever. You'll become known as the woman who got involved with her own uncle. I'll be the businessman who transgressed family taboos. We'll never have a normal life again." "Do you think our life is already normal?" Emily laughed bitterly. "We live in the shadows. We meet in secret. We hide what we feel from the entire world. This isn't life, Michael. It's existence." The observation hit him like a punch. Emily was right. They had become prisoners of their own love, slaves to a secret that prevented them from living fully. Perhaps it was time to break the chains, even if it meant facing the consequences. "How do you want to do this?" Michael asked, his voice indicating he was seriously considering the proposal. "An interview," Emily answered, clearly having already thought through all the details. "For a respectable television program or a serious magazine. We tell our complete story from the beginning, how we met, how we fell in love, the discovery about our family connection. We show that we didn't know about the kinship when we got involved, that when we discovered it, we tried to stay away from each other, but that love was stronger." Michael considered the idea. If well executed, they could frame their story as a romantic tragedy. Two soulmates who discovered each other against all odds, only to discover that fate had placed seemingly insurmountable obstacles in their path. The American public tended to sympathize with stories of impossible love. "We would need someone we could trust," he said, his mind already working on the practical aspects. "Someone who would give us editorial control, who wouldn't turn our story into cheap sensation." "Do you know people like that?" Emily asked. "I know," Michael confirmed. "Christine Matthews from PBS. She's a serious journalist, treats delicate subjects with respect, and she owes me a few favors." During the days that followed, Michael discreetly contacted Christine, explaining the situation without revealing compromising details. The journalist, initially skeptical, became intrigued with the promise of a story that would change the public perception about the limits of love. They scheduled a meeting to discuss the terms of the interview. Meanwhile, Emily prepared herself psychologically to expose her intimate life to public judgment. She knew it would be cruel. Social media, sensationalist programs, gossip magazines, all would dissect her, judge her choices, question her morals. But she also knew it was the only way to break the power Robert had over them. The meeting with Christine took place at a discreet restaurant in Greenwich Village. The journalist, a 50-year-old woman with grey hair and perceptive eyes, listened to their story in silence, occasionally asking pointed questions to clarify details. When Michael and Emily finished telling everything, she remained silent for several minutes. "It's an extraordinary story," she said finally. "Problematic, controversial, but extraordinary. Do you understand that regardless of how I present it, there will be judgment? There will be people who will consider you an abomination." "We understand," Emily responded, "but there will also be people who will understand that love doesn't choose the circumstances in which it appears." Christine nodded. "I can make a respectful documentary, focusing on the psychological and emotional aspects of your situation, but I need total editorial control. I cannot accept interference in the final narrative." Michael hesitated. Handing over control of his reputation to another person went against all his instincts as a successful businessman. But Emily squeezed his hand under the table, and he knew there was no alternative. "I accept," he said. The filming was scheduled for the following week, at a neutral location that Christine had chosen. But before they could proceed with the plan, Robert made his move. One morning, Michael woke up with dozens of missed calls from his press office. During the night, a sensationalist blog had published an explosive article. "Billionaire businessman maintains incestuous relationship with orphaned niece." The article was cruel and distorted, painting Michael as a predator who had used his power to seduce a vulnerable young woman. Emily was portrayed as a naive victim or a calculating opportunist, depending on the paragraph. Robert had sold the story to the worst type of media possible, ensuring it would be presented in the most sordid way possible. Within hours, the story spread across all social networks. Michael's name became a trending topic, accompanied by hashtags like Mount Predator Billionaire and Incest Scandal. Photographs of the two of them were scoured and published, including security images showing Emily entering and leaving Michael's building. Emily, who was at the boarding house when the story broke, found a crowd of reporters and onlookers at the door of the building. She managed to escape through the back with Megan's help, but she knew she wouldn't have anywhere to hide for long. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, sensationalist programs, all wanting her version of the facts. Michael, for his part, locked himself in his penthouse, rejecting all attempts at contact from the press. His company went into crisis mode, with advisors trying to control the damage while the stock price plummeted on the market. Shareholders demanded explanations, business partners cancelled contracts, and his entire professional life crumbled in a matter of hours. But what tormented him most wasn't the destruction of his financial empire. It was his concern for Emily. The articles about her were particularly cruel, digging up every detail of her childhood in the orphanage, her life of poverty, painting her as a gold digger who had seduced her rich uncle. Michael knew she would be suffering immensely with all that exposure. When he finally managed to contact her, Emily was hiding in a cheap hotel on the outskirts, registered under a false name. Her voice was hoarse from crying so much, and Michael felt his heart break into pieces when he heard her. "They're saying terrible things about me," she whispered on the phone, "that I planned everything, that I only approached you because I discovered we were related and wanted to take advantage. They're interviewing people from the orphanage, inventing stories about my past." "Emily, listen to me," Michael said, his voice firm despite the fury he felt. "Nothing that these vultures are saying matters. What we have is real, it's true, and no one can take that away from us." "But what now?" she asked. "Our strategy failed. Robert has already told the story his way. How are we going to recover from this?" Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all the decisions that had led them to this point. He knew there was only one thing to do, only one way to protect Emily from the storm they had unleashed. "We're going to disappear," he said. "Tonight. We have identities ready, money in offshore accounts, everything we need to start over somewhere else. We're going to leave the country and never come back." The proposal of escape sounded like music to Emily's ears. After days of being pursued by reporters, having her life dissected by the sensationalist press, the idea of simply disappearing and starting over somewhere far away seemed the only possible salvation. But there was still a part of her that hesitated to completely abandon America, the only land she knew. "Where would we go?" she asked, already knowing she would follow Michael anywhere in the world. "Portugal," Michael answered without hesitation. "I have properties there, connections that can help us establish a new life. It's far enough that our story won't reach us, but still a country that speaks a language we can learn, where we can adapt more easily." That same night, Michael put a meticulously elaborated escape plan into motion. Using contacts at the airport and a private jet company, he organized a discreet exit from the country. Emily would be removed from the hotel by a private security team and taken directly to a private hangar at LaGuardia, where Michael would be waiting for her with fake documents and tickets to Lisbon. But while the preparations were being made, something unexpected happened. Christine Matthews, the journalist who had agreed to make the documentary about them, managed to track Emily to the hotel where she was hiding. Instead of trying to force an interview or expose her location, she simply asked to talk, alone, without cameras. "I saw the articles," Christine said when Emily reluctantly agreed to receive her in the hotel room. "I saw how they distorted your story, how they transformed you into caricatures, but I still believe there's a true version of this story that deserves to be told." Emily, exhausted by the constant pursuit of the media, initially resisted. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said. "People have already decided who we are. Nothing we say will change that." "You're wrong," Christine insisted. "America is a country of soap operas, a people who love stories of impossible love. If we tell your story the right way, if we show the humanity behind the scandal, we can change the narrative." The conversation that followed lasted hours. Emily, for the first time since the scandal exploded, could tell her version of the facts to someone who listened without judgment. She spoke about her lonely childhood in the orphanage, about the years of invisibility, about how Michael had been the first person to really see her. She told about the discovery of the family connection, about the moral dilemma they faced, about the conscious decision to choose love despite the obstacles. Christine recorded everything on a small digital recorder, capturing not just Emily's words, but the raw emotion in her voice, the sincerity that no sensationalist had bothered to look for. When the interview ended, she had decided she would make the documentary, even if Emily fled the country. "I need you to think carefully before leaving," Christine said as she was leaving. "Running will confirm in many people's minds that you're guilty of something. But if you stay, if you tell your story with dignity, you can transform this scandal into a story of redemption." Emily promised to consider it, but her mind was already made up. She couldn't face the public judgment anymore, couldn't bear to see Michael being torn apart by the media because of her. Escape seemed the only alternative for them to have any chance at happiness. That early morning, Emily met Michael at the private hangar. He was waiting for her beside a private jet, dressed casually, without the business arrogance that had always characterized him. He looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more determined than she had ever seen him. "Ready to start our new life?" he asked, taking her in his arms. But before Emily could answer, powerful lights illuminated the hangar. They weren't spotlights from the press or authorities trying to prevent their escape. It was a small and discreet film crew, led by Christine Matthews. "Please," the journalist shouted, approaching them with hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to show you something that will change everything." Michael instinctively placed himself between Christine and Emily, ready to protect her from another media invasion. But Emily touched his arm, curious about what the journalist had to show. Christine turned on a tablet and showed them a video. It was an excerpt from a television program that had aired a few hours earlier, a roundtable on complex relationships with psychologists, sociologists, and family law experts. To Emily and Michael's surprise, the discussion was compassionate and nuanced. "What we see here is not a case of predation or opportunism," a renowned psychologist was saying. "It's an extreme example of how love can arise in the most unlikely circumstances. These two people met as strangers, fell in love as equals, and only afterward discovered a family connection that neither had chosen." Another expert added, "Legally, there was no crime. Morally, it's a complex situation that each of us must evaluate according to our own values. But humanly, it's impossible not to recognize the sincerity of the feelings involved." "Public opinion is changing," Christine explained, turning off the tablet. "After the initial shock, people are beginning to see you not as monsters, but as two people who faced an impossible situation and chose love. There are comments on social networks defending you. There are people asking for you to be left in peace." Emily felt tears spring to her eyes. For days, she had believed the entire world condemned them, that there was no hope of acceptance or understanding. But perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps there were people capable of seeing beyond the superficial scandal and recognizing the humanity of their story. "What are you proposing?" Michael asked, clearly skeptical but interested. "That you stay. "That you face this with dignity," Christine answered. "Let me tell your true story, not as a sensationalist scandal, but as a reflection on the complex nature of human love. You can become symbols of courage, of people who chose authenticity instead of social hypocrisy." Michael looked at Emily, seeking in her eyes the answer that would guide their fate. He saw fear there, but also a spark of the strength that had attracted him since the first day. Emily had faced a difficult childhood, years of invisibility, and now she was ready to face one more challenge if it meant they could be together without hiding. "And if it doesn't work?" Emily asked. "What if we continue to be hated, judged, rejected?" "Then at least we'll know we tried," Michael responded, making his decision. "And we'll be together, not as fugitives, but as people who fought for the right to love." 6 months later, Christine Matthews' documentary was shown on a Sunday night on PBS. Love Without Borders told the story of Michael and Emily with sensitivity and depth, exploring not just the facts but the emotions, the moral dilemmas and the psychological complexities of their situation. The program was a success with audiences and critics, generating national debates about the limits of love and social prejudices. Michael had lost a good part of his financial empire, but discovered that he didn't care as much as he expected. He opened a smaller consultancy, more focused on social projects than on maximum profit. Emily went back to studying, taking psychology courses at a private university, determined to help other people who faced complex family situations. They married in a small and private ceremony, with just a few loyal friends who had remained loyal during the media storm. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. They still faced curious looks on the street, malicious comments on social networks, and the occasional sensationalist article when some outlet needed easy ratings. But they were happy. They had chosen love over social convenience, authenticity over public approval, and they discovered that, for two people who had spent their entire lives feeling alone in the world, having found each other was miracle enough to compensate for any external judgment. On quiet nights when they were alone in their new house in Santa Barbara, far from the bustle of New York, Michael and Emily often remembered that first dawn in the office, when two lost souls had recognized each other in the darkness. They had traveled an impossible path to arrive there, faced obstacles that could have destroyed any relationship, but survived because their love had been forged in the flames of shared suffering. And when Emily discovered she was pregnant, 2 years after the marriage, both knew they had finally found not just love but redemption from all the pains of the past. Their daughter would grow up in a family where love was stronger than conventions, where the courage to be authentic was worth more than society's approval. The empire that Michael had built had crumbled, but he had found something much more valuable, a home where he was loved not for what he possessed but for who he was. And Emily, who had spent her entire life being invisible, finally had someone who saw her completely. Not just her virtues, but also her shadows, and loved her for all of it. It was an imperfect ending for an impossible story, but it was their ending. One with blood, sweat, and an iron determination that true love was worth any sacrifice.